Canadian buddy from the wrong side of the country has come over. So Scott Moore worked on Gitcoin, which you may or may not know about. So Gitcoin is not a coin. There was not an ICO.
Actually, very important note, yeah.
Indeed. But it is a mechanism for basically, bounties or rewards where people can incentivize people to fix issues on GitHub projects by putting a bounty on it and that being paid out.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm here to talk a bit about Gitcoin, but I'm more broadly here to talk about open source, which kind of underpins everything that we're doing, not just in Web3, but historically in the web and in software generally. So I guess to frame the conversation, just want to give you a bit of background, what is open source? What does it mean for something to actually be open source? This is not a canonical definition. There's lots of different interpretations of what open source means. But in general, the source code needs to be available. It needs to be royalty free. There needs to be effectively free distribution of the software. And it needs to retain the original software license. So there are many of these licenses. There's MIT, there's GPL. There's a lot of new ones coming out actually, which are aiming to have some kind of ethics built into them around some of the current controversies, mainly in US tech, which I won't get into in too much detail. But some of these characteristics can be swapped or modified. This is just the baseline for what open source actually is. And so why do we care about it? I kind of alluded to this, but it's actually a huge number of applications that use open source. 96% actually rely on open source software. It's pretty much every piece of software that you might use. I actually think this is slightly outdated at this point, and it's probably slightly higher. But it really doesn't matter whether it's 96 or 98%. At that point, we should really give a shit about what open source, I don't know if I can say that up here, but about what open source is about. On average, 57% of code, again, is from open source software. And it's, if we want to give economic value to it, about $400 billion worth of value. I probably should have edited this slide, because you'll notice below that there's an ETH value there, which is also out of date, by the way. But in general, the important point to note here is that open source generates a lot of value, not just for the blockchain ecosystem, but for the general open source ecosystem and for the software industry generally. So why is it that there's only maybe 1 to 2 maintainers per core repository? Why is it that so many different pieces of software that we rely on, for example, OpenSSL, most packages within the NPM ecosystem if you're a JavaScript user, lots of Rust packages, lots of pretty much any software package in any language you can imagine, all the way down to the Linux kernel development. Why are there so few maintainers for these pieces of software? And largely, although there's arguments to be made about this, one of the major reasons is that there's no pay for open source work. So actually, 62% of respondents in this recent survey, which was done in part by libraries.io, were self-funded. And then the remainder, the largest second percentage, were basically given money by their employer to do it. And then there's a long tail of other options. There's consulting, there's crowdfunding, there's grants. These are all okay options, but they don't really solve the core problem of what basically a sustainable open source software ecosystem would look like. And this is particularly important today because the scale of software, as we've all seen, is growing pretty exponentially. 208,000 users were basically using SourceForge back in 2001 in a 2-week period. 31 million now are using GitHub. So it's a pretty large increase. And yet, the same amount of work is being done by, orders of magnitude more work actually, is being done by the same amount of people. And so it's not surprising then that you get cases of burnout. This is just one example of Semantic UI, which was sort of like a Vue.js or a React style front-end library, which was basically after 3 years sunset just because Jack couldn't pay the bills doing it. A more prominent example is OpenSSL. This is probably a bit hard to read on the screen, but in short, OpenSSL was and still does power a lot of security on the web. And it was maintained by like 1 or 2 people. There was a huge vulnerability in 2014, I believe, called Heartbleed. And then people started to care because this package that had been kind of relied on by everyone for so long and not funded was suddenly causing them problems. Just one more example, which is relatively recent, with the event stream library, which is a just popular NPM package. This is actually just an anecdote from Dominic Tarr, who wrote this library, which I very much empathize with, which is like, okay, so he worked as a dishwasher in this restaurant. He made the mistake of being too competent. He got promoted to cook. He got like a 50-cent pay raise. That's great, but being an open source maintainer writing a popular module is like this times a million without the pay rise. So it's actually slightly worse than getting a sort of like position as sort of like a promotion within a kitchen to a cook. And like both of these types of work are extremely important, but it's clear that Dominic Tarr's work and the work of these maintainers is affecting just a massively larger number of people. So we should really be like considering why is it that the work that they're doing isn't proportionally being compensated. So how do we solve this? We obviously have a bias towards our solution, but I think that this is just one framing for the general problem and one solution that could be considered, which is this magic instrument of money we've made. So programming basically money, programming our values into money, gives us the ability to actually fund more open source software, and it incentivizes communities like ETC, like ETH, like Bitcoin, to give back to open source in a way that didn't really happen before Web3 was kind of like coined as a term. And fundamentally, the reason for this is partially selfish. It's partially that we have the ability to like gain money or value for ourselves by giving back to these like core pieces of infrastructure that are open source to begin with that power our ecosystems. But at the same time, it's just a general ethos that I think has permeated Web3 culture, which is open source has value on its own and should be supported regardless of what the core intention is of it. And so as a result, we see a lot more open source projects being funded in Web3 than we did in previous iterations of the web. And so our mechanism for sort of getting some of this value that is being generated in open source and given back to open source is bounties, first and foremost, as Bob mentioned, which is essentially taking money from funders and giving it to coders per GitHub issue in an open source repo. This is just one approach, and it sort of is a way to get people started in the process of building open source software. It's effectively a way to get users of open source software to become contributors in a very granular way. So this is just an example of like a small 60 DAI bounty on a parity repo, very simple sort of like initial problem, very small initial amount, basically gives people the ability to think about these problems and get involved and get some funding for it. And so far we've done a pretty good job of like growing this ecosystem, just some stats like 500 plus funders, 20,000 plus developers, 4,000 or more transactions, and then that's since 2017. But the more important part actually to me, rather than user and contributor, which is actually pretty important for Web3 right now, is getting contributors to become maintainers. And that's really where we've started to put a lot more of our effort. So we started this grants program, which has actually just finished its 3rd iteration. Basically a kind of patronage model for open source, a way to basically give back to individual maintainers and then give them agency to use those funds as they choose, either to pay other contributors or to generally fund their own work, their own time. And so we did a round originally, which was 50K plus contributed to open source. We had basically this capital constrained liberal radicalism matching model, which I won't get into in too much detail, but essentially the way it worked was you had the ability to fund any number of projects to signal your interest, and then the square of the sum of the square roots of those amounts would be matched. So if 2 people matched gave $4 each, the matching amount for that particular grant would be $16. And if 8 people donated $1 each, the matching amount would be $64. The point of that is that the signal is getting more and more valuable the more and more people contribute, not necessarily the more money that's contributed. And this was just the paper that started it. It was by Vitalik, Zoe, and Glenn. And this is just a representation of what that looks like. So the same amount of actual money is being donated in each of these bars, but the number of contributors is increasing in each consecutive bar. So the point is, let's make funding more democratic. Let's match people based on the actual democratic interest in a project. And we've done a few rounds of this. So here's just a few examples of projects that have been funded to date with this model, and a few more. I won't get into too much detail on these, probably something that would be worth looking into afterwards, though. And we just finished our third round, which is actually the largest one yet, which had about $250K donated to open source, including matching funding, and 1,500 plus contributions. So this is actually, surprisingly to me, actually, starting to become a really valuable model for getting a lot more people donating to core maintainers than was happening in the ecosystem previously. Because although we're better than Web 2 at funding open source, we're still not great at it. There's still a lot that can be done to improve how we're supporting maintainers. But this is all still patronage. So all the models I've talked about so far, either giving money to contributors for their work, or giving money to maintainers to continue their projects, is largely reliant on the kindness of strangers to provide them with funding and ensure that they're able to make ends meet. But what are some other models? These are a few more controversial ones that I just wanted to touch on. I'm not necessarily saying I advocate for them or support them. But this was an EIP 1789 within the ETH ecosystem, which was largely around trying to add some form of dev fund to the mining rewards. There was a recent similar proposal, 2025, which was for 1.x block rewards. Both of these were sort of received very controversially. Some people were like huge advocates of this model. Some people thought that this was going too far or was a deviation from the actual ethics or values of the chains that they were being proposed on. But regardless of what you think of them, the important thing to note about these models is just that these are experiments around how we can fund these maintainers who are, again, like being generally overworked relative to what they're being paid in a more sustainable way, such that we're not relying necessarily only on the kindness of strangers. A similar model, which is sort of more, I guess, opt-in, is like a support contract model. So, if you use the software as an enterprise, maybe you should be paying a fee to get support on that particular piece of software. This is what Firas Abukajije suggested a month back. He's been running this experiment where he's basically been offering consulting on his NPM packages. For those of you who don't know, he runs, I think, over 100 NPM packages. He's sort of like one of the maintainers on each of those, some more than others, cumulatively, which have about 100 million downloads a month. And so this is a good example of an experiment in open source funding, which is super useful for, I think, and worth considering for our ecosystems here too. Another one, which is, again, controversial, is advertising. So this is another Firas example where he put an ad in his NPM install, basically, CLI. So basically, you would see an ad every time you try to install one of Firas's packages. And lots of people are pretty angry at him about this, which is, I guess, kind of reasonable. I can see why that might happen. But I think the point of this experiment is more interesting than that, which is he kind of showcased that people are very quick to get angry about things without actually doing anything. And so, like, I think that largely speaking, what he showed was, hey, here's like an idea, here's a model, and he just got people thinking about this problem in general. And I think that was helpful, even if you disagree with the model itself. But we're actually sort of biased towards at least experimenting with an advertising model. And so I want to touch on one project, which is sort of part of the Gitcoin suite of projects called CodeFund, which has largely been focused on a more ethical advertising model where people aren't tracked, people aren't being basically like sold in the same way as in traditional advertising. And what this has done has actually like been a great way for Rollbar, for DigitalOcean, and for other major players in Web 2. It's been a great way for them to basically get the attention of large like open source maintainers. So there's two ways this works. This is actually based on an older project called CodeSponsor, which Eric Berry started before pivoting to this model. CodeSponsor was effectively ads on GitHub repos. So every GitHub repo could have a sponsor. That sponsor would be facilitating basically the work that this maintainer is doing. This is an extension of that where he's gotten a list of publishers and a list of advertisers, but basically whitelisted them in a way where he knows that they're valid, he knows that they're doing good work, and leveraged that to make sure that there's at least some amount of targeting without having to provide like particular kind of more invasive targeting that Facebook or Google might take part in. So I think that this sort of model is one that we're going to be promoting a lot more in the coming months, in addition to the bounties, in addition to the grants. And I think it's worth, as an ecosystem, us being like at least aware or considering these models more seriously, as long as they're done in a relatively ethical way. So this is sort of everything that I wanted to cover in terms of what we're up to. Ultimately, though, I think might be clear at this point, my takeaway from this talk, or for you for this talk, is just think about what models look like for your open source projects, what funding models would make sense, how people who are working on your projects are currently getting paid, and just think about what can be done to make that a bigger centerpiece of your strategies, of your organizational sort of like ethics and values. I think the Web3 space, again, is doing an amazing job in this regard. I think relative to Web 2, we're like orders of magnitude better. But I think the important part for the takeaway here is just to consider these more actively in the days ahead, in the weeks ahead, in the months ahead, as you all build out your projects here. Thanks so much. Any questions?
Yeah, that awesome project, like so desperately needed.
Thanks.
So thank you for doing it. I think I don't want to say there's an inherent flaw in the nature of open source, but it's just the nature of abuse of open source creators and maintainers, that they're just being abused by people that actually don't want to compensate them for their work. So is there not some way, I mean, you've come up with a lot of innovative examples here, and some of which are working well. Is there not some way that commercial adoption of that code would come with a price versus like?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good consideration. So that sort of goes to the support contract model, which is one of the ones that for us was working on. Tidelift is another company that's doing something similar in this regard, trying to get people paid for basically supporting particular companies that are willing to basically work with them on particular features. I think that's a good model for certain types of open source projects. So a company like Docker, it's very easy to get a company like Docker to support themselves by enterprise payments. It's easy for them to go and pitch individual enterprises, hey, we'll give you this additional Docker support package. I'm just using them as an example, by the way. We don't have any affiliation with Docker, obviously. It's harder for a project like OpenSSL to do that same thing because it's so pervasive, it's so widely used. And I think the kind of funny thing is the more widely used a project is, the less that model works. So it's kind of a classic tragedy of the commons problem. Ultimately, I do think that should be explored. But I think for projects like core infrastructure of internet layer projects, it's probably not going to be sufficient. Oh, sorry.
I got the mic.
My bad.
Do you have any plans in your roadmap to have cross-chain integrations with ETC or ETH
Yes.
other than ETH?
So I didn't want to hint too much, but there are some announcements, and Terry did allude to this as well, that we are talking actively with ETC Labs about collaborating, and I do think that we're not an Ethereum-only project. I think one of the takeaways from this talk, which was kind of implicit, but I didn't really state, is that open source is not specifically one chain. It's not ETH. It's not Bitcoin. It's not ETC. It's any arbitrary project that happens to want to support this model that sort of was outlined by those 3 principles at the start. And I think that we definitely want to work with as many chains as possible because all those chains are open source and they're all supporting that vision. And so we're fully supportive of ETC Labs, and we want to definitely collaborate further.
Great, thank you.
So first of all, I love the ideas proposed here, especially as someone who has had to abandon open source projects for paying jobs in the past. But for your patronage models, it seems as if the majority of people who would be interested would be others passionate in open source software. So I'm not sure if you'd end up having a sort of net zero funding within the community as a whole. Are there any plans to attract those outside the open source community?
Yeah, and so there's 2 levels of that. Part of that goes back to the comment made earlier about basically a corporate model, or a model where you have companies paying for support or paying for additional features, commercialization of open source software. The other side of that, I think, is just this sort of advocacy where people are made more aware of the value of open source software. There's lots of foundations, for example, it's a different level of patronage. So again, there's still problems potentially with that model. But a lot of not open source foundations, a lot of general nonprofit NGO foundation types support particular agendas that don't include open source in any meaningful way. So for example, I won't name names, but there are a lot of projects, for example, that will support activism, or will support work in journalism, or will support humanitarian aid. But they won't support particular software projects that happen to support those next level, those at the forefront, on the ground organizations. So it happens that sometimes open source software gets funded as a result of those organizations getting funded and those organizations giving back to the open source community. But I think one important piece that could help there, which is definitely something that we're trying to do more actively, and that a lot of others in even the Web 2 ecosystem are trying to do more actively, is get those larger institutional philanthropic organizations looking at open source as its own category for funding, rather than just a facilitator of some other alternate mandate or goal. Cool. Any last questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Do you have
where's that coming from?
any ideas on how this could work with institutionalized things like Open Collective or the GitHub Sponsors program? Because we have a bunch of money in our Open Collective, and it's kind of a pain to send it around the world, which would be perfect for kind of getting this to kind of work together.
Yeah, so first and foremost, we're huge supporters of the work that Open Collective are doing. We know PA relatively well. We think that it's an extremely important model, and we're really only in the crypto ecosystem. So I mean, it's very much, we're in our niche, and we think that they're doing important work outside of that to support Web 2 open source. I think that ultimately Web 3 is probably the better path forward for the reasons I mentioned. There's just a lot more support and interest in open source technology, and it's harder to convince people in sort of Web 2 that open source is even something that they should be pursuing, let alone something that they should be funding, whereas here it's obvious that we're pursuing it. Open Collective has sort of a similar model to what we're doing with grants. So there's some similarity with Gitcoin grants in the sense that it's a monthly subscription that you can basically give to any project. And any project can apply as well to have their little card on there in the same way as Open Collective. It's just specific to sort of the blockchain ecosystem at the moment. But we think they're doing great work, and we want to see more collaboration on that front as well. On the GitHub sponsor side, we think that's really great work as well. I think we're really huge fans of everything they've been doing lately, even around dependency tracking and vulnerability tracking and so forth, that I think, I'm really impressed, I guess, with Nat in particular. I think he's done an amazing job in such a short time frame already. We've been doing some work kind of like just advising or providing like our feedback on the program. And there's been a few other organizations doing that, but we haven't really discussed very actively with them what that might look like. Cool. Thanks so much, all.